Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. I begin in the name of Allah, the Compassionate, the Merciful. Alhamdulillah, by the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we continue our discussions on the psychology of Surah Al-Hamd, with particular regard to why it might be that we have been required to recite this chapter at least 10 times a day, just through the 5 obligatory prayers. What are the aspects of this surah, of this chapter, that make it so important? And in particular, what are the aspects of psychology within it? What are the psychological dimensions within it that we can use for our daily lives? Our discussions thus far have not been about adding to the things that you have to do. No, the objective of these discussions is to try and get more value from what we are already doing in our daily lives, so that we may get more benefit, particularly psychological benefit, to help challenge the issues that we face in terms of stress, anxiety, depression, how we may be able to benefit from this chapter that we recite so much, that is central to the Holy Quran, the importance of which we've discussed at length in our early discussions. The first 4 verses that we focused on set the context of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's engagement with creation, from beginning with the idea of His general unmanifest form of Allah, through to the manifest forms of Rahman, of the most compassionate for all creatures and all creation, to Rahim, offering specific grace to those who turn to Him, as well as in the 4th verse, the idea of accountability, of Malik, of the Master of the Day of Judgment, so that we may balance our sentiment of hope and confidence to move forward purposefully with His grace, versus a recognition that we need to be cognizant of what we do, how we do it, to whom we do it, so that we may be vehicles of grace, of compassion, rather than perpetrators of injustice, both to ourselves and to others. The next section of the chapter represents an important shift in the nature, tone and philosophy of this chapter, with the corresponding differences in the psychology that it offers for our daily benefit. The 5th verse, being Iyaka na'budu wa iyaka nasta'in, that you alone do we worship, that you alone do we worship, and you alone do we seek help from. Now, this is quite important, because the grammatical structure of the verse being Iyaka na'budu, that you alone do we worship, rather than saying na'budu iyaka, saying we worship you. But the idea being that if you began by saying na'budu, we worship, then it raises the question, who do we worship? It could be any number of things. Whereas by prefacing the sentence with iyaka, it grounds the entire verse in Tawheed, in the oneness of Allah. By beginning with iyaka, you and you alone, na'budu, do we worship, it removes any context of shirk, which is incredibly important, particularly for those followers of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, who are often accused, heaven forbid, of shirk, of ascribing partners to Allah, by seeking the assistance of the Aimma alayhim salam, the Abrar, the saints mentioned in the Holy Quran. We find that we turn to the Holy Quran to understand the Holy Quran. Surah Baqarah, Surah 2, verse 255, makes very clear, مَنْ ذَا الَّذِي يَشْفَعُ إِنْدَهُ إِلَّا بِإِذْنِهِ, who is there who can intercede with Him other than through His permission? And therefore, any seeking of shafa, of intercession, is entirely circumscribed within the parameters of the Surah Al-Hamd, and in particular within the opening assertion of verse 5 of this chapter of Iyyaka na'budu, of you alone do we worship. So any other form of shafa is through the grace and the power bestowed bi-idhni, as we see in verse 255 of Surah Baqarah, of through his permission, of through his grace that he has enabled shafa and intercession. It's also noteworthy that the structuring of this verse also provides some food for thought in terms of how seeking assistance, إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ, that you alone do we seek help from, that asking for help is predicated upon recognition of who we are seeking help from. This idea of na'budu, of worship, a lot of it is psychological in terms of acknowledging Tawheed, the Shahada of La ilaha illallah, Muhammadun Rasulullah. Those key principles are embedded within an awareness of divine grace and divine unity, so that any idea of Iyyaka nasta'in, of seeking help, can and only arises through the recognition of Tawheed. Furthermore, we also have a shift in the grammar, whereby Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is referred to now in the second person, Iyyaka na'budu, that you alone do we worship. Whereas in the preceding 4 verses, it was referred to in the third person. So we've got a shift in the nature of the dialogue. We've also got an important shift in the way in which the individual expresses himself. So this idea of na'budu is also got aspects of being of servitude, of abd, of being a slave to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is not in the negative sense that the word slave often has nowadays, but really about alignment of all notions of purpose as being entirely within the realm of grace. That is our objective. Those are the values by which we freely choose to enslave ourselves, by which we freely choose to align ourselves, by which we freely choose to enact and empower ourselves to be. So that this has got a metaphysical aspect of what it means to be a human being. Furthermore, we see that in the Holy Quran, for example, in chapter 19, verse 93, it says, "There is none in the heavens and on the earth, but that it comes under the compassionate servitude of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala." So that this this idea of abd is really about our recognition of being part of creation itself, the entirety of creation itself. And so we also have this notion of complete servitude by being part of the entirety of creation. But furthermore, from a sentence construction point of view, from a grammatical point of view, this is reflected in the fact that the direct object is placed before the verb of Iyyaka, you alone, na'budu being the verb, do we worship. So this completion of our servitude and devotion and fidelity to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We also have another aspect grammatically of how the individual approaches divinity through a collective. So we have the term na'budu, we worship. It's not just me standing on my own saying, here, this is what I'm doing. No, this is about saying that we collectively as humanity, as an ummah, approach you as divinity through your grace. And this idea of community is then embedded into both servitude as well as seeking assistance. Nasta'in is also rendered in this collective sense of we. And that means that we should not ever think of ourselves as being separated from the society that we're in. And that our very servitude and our asking for assistance is deeply embedded, inextricably linked to our social dimensions as social creatures. And from a psychological point of view, where there's a lot of research to show how the more socially connected we are, the better protected we are from suffering from the ravages of depression and other mental health problems such as anxiety. And in addition, in order to free ourselves when we become ensnared by these mental health conditions, one of the ways we can do that is to become more active socially. And this verse 5 of the Holy Quran, by integrating the idea of community into the very notion of worship through na'budu, through the noon there, through the collective, reminds us that we need to remain rooted in our society and in our social conscience. Because when we become separated from that, we become vulnerable to a whole litany of dangers, including in the psychological dimension as well. It also is an aspect, this idea of collectively referring to Allah is also an aspect of humility. That only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that only divinity itself has the right to use the singular of I. It is yet another reinforcement of Tawheed. And it is also a way of inoculating our hearts, of providing a spiritual vaccine against arrogance, such that whatever progress is made is through the collective prayer that we may have for one another. This nasta'een aspect of verse 5 has an important psychological thread to it, because it allows us to join forces for achieving things that may seem beyond our reach. We may be disempowered, unmotivated to, for instance, effect real change in our communities, effect real change within ourselves. We have so much in positive psychology about the need for a coach, about the need for support systems. Yet the idea of nasta'een is inherently connected to this, because we recognize that we do not work in individual silos, but we need to join hands with others, that we need support. And it's okay to ask for support. All too often, mental health problems are swept under the carpet because they're taboo, that it is somehow not okay to say that I am depressed, that I need help. Yet the Holy Quran, in the chapter that we recite 10 times a day by obligation, reminds us that our very worship is collective, na'budu, that our very seeking of help is also collective, nasta'een, such that asking for help is inherent to a human being. And that not only should we ask for help when we need it, but we should also, therefore, by corollary, be very willing to share help and give help, and indeed actively seek out those who may be feeling down, who need a helping hand at this point in time, so that we may be faithful in our implementation of this verse of Iyaka na'budu wa iyaka nasta'een, that you alone do we worship and you alone do we seek help from. And this collective is also reflected in Surah 6, Surah An'am, verse 165, which talks about the responsibilities placed upon humanity, saying, and it is He, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who has made you the successors upon the earth, the vicegerents, those who are responsible, saying, Huwalladhi, it is He, Ja'alakum, who has made you in the collective, kum, Ja'alakum, Khala'if al-ard, the caretakers of the earth, those who are responsible for the earth, those indeed who have the responsibility to ensure that society and indeed the environment is managed and utilized in keeping with our recognition that these are all manifestations of grace and should not therefore be abused. It's got an aspect of responsibility. It's also got an aspect of asraf, of wasting. We may teach our children about not wasting food on the plate. Yet this verse of Iyaka na'budu wa iyaka nasta'in reminds us of the asraf, of the wasting of opportunities, of working together, the collective aspect of how we refer to him, and also not to waste the bounties that he has bestowed after we have sought his help. So we may have sought his help to get a job. But then the question is, what do we do with that job? How do we fulfill the potential of that job? We may have sought his help to be able to get onto a particular course, a particular form of education. But how do we utilize the full potential of that education so that we don't waste, so that asraf does not enter into our nasta'in, our aspect of seeking his assistance? From the point of view of the psychology of mindfulness, we see that this fifth verse of the Holy Quran, particularly with the way it begins, of Iyaka na'budu, is an invitation to grounding our awareness, of bringing our focus back to the present moment. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is in the present moment, is manifest in the present moment. If we lose ourselves with worrying about the past or the future, we are no longer present for na'budu, for our worship, because a key aspect of worship is our witnessing, our presence in the arena of divine grace. As soon as we lose ourselves in concerns about what may have happened or worrying about what may happen in the future, we are disconnected from the present moment. We are disconnected from the reality, from the haqiqah, from the true realization of Allah's manifestation in the unfolding of each present moment. And the psychology of mindfulness reminds us of the mental health benefits, including for anxiety and depression, of utilizing techniques that bring our attention back to the present moment, that present-centeredness, whether it's through formal meditation, for instance, dhikr practices that this surah encourages. For example, the names of Allah that are present in this surah are used for dhikr purposes, for mindfulness meditation. But equally, our mindfulness in everyday life, as we are driving, as we're cooking, as we're eating, as we go about our daily life, to be rooted in the present moment. That becomes impossible when we are lost in our thoughts about the past or the future. Because then it's no longer about iyaka. It's no longer about you and you alone. It is about us and our past, us and our future. And that disconnects us from the grace of Allah. So mindfulness is inherent. It's weaved into the very fabric of this verse. And it therefore is inherent to the notion of worship, of na'budu. So that when we recite the verse in its entirety, Iyaka na'budu wa iyaka nasta'in, you alone do we worship and you alone do we seek help from. And we recite this 10 times a day, from Surah Fajr all the way from Salatul Fajr in the morning, all the way through the day, up to the evening. We are constantly replenishing our cup at the fountain of divine assistance, so that our thirst through the day may be quenched by grace. And by acknowledging that, we may remain present in the moment. And through that presence, be a form of grace for others, so that as we receive divine assistance through our calling, through nasta'in, we may also recognize that there is a feedback loop between nasta'in and na'budu, so that as we receive assistance, we may then worship Allah through serving creation, so that there is a continuity between Iyaka na'budu wa iyaka nasta'in. that you alone do we worship, you alone do we seek help from. When we receive that help, that feeds back into the process by which we worship, through being engaged in the world around us, by being of service to those around us, in keeping with the mission of the one who brought us this Surah Al-Hamd, in keeping with the Rahmatan lil Alameen. Excuse me. The warning about not being mindful is a salient one. From the master of spiritual psychology, from Imam Jafar Sadiq alayhi salam, we have a salient warning where he says that in regard to this na'budu of worshipping Allah, he says, in a teaching that is well known in the community, he says there are three kinds of worship. There's the worship of the fearful slave who just worships out of fear of the punishment, of the wrath of Allah. Then there's the fear, then there is the worship, there's the kind of na'budu that you get among business people who only do it out of profit, out of seeking the reward that they may get for that worship. But Imam Jafar Sadiq Islam says, from a spiritual psychology point of view, the highest level of worship is the worship of the free, the worship of those who free themselves of all the concerns of gain and loss, of conditionality, but unconditionally open their hearts to taste the sweetness of connection, of qurbah, of when we say we are doing something qurbatan ilallah, to gain closeness to Allah. The worship of the free, when we look at what does na'budu mean, what are the different levels of na'budu, the sixth Holy Imam guides us that we have various levels by which we may implement this idea of na'budu. Let us strive for the highest, to be truly free, to choose through our own volition to be present in the moment, so that we unconditionally open our hearts to the mindfulness of divine grace as it manifests beautifully and differently from one moment to the next, so that our recitation of this verse, إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ, at Isha time in the evening is different to the way we recited it in the afternoon at Dhahr, to the way we may have recited it at Fajr, because our understanding of the way in which grace has manifested throughout the day is deepened as we have experienced more at the end of the day than at the beginning. And this raises a question. How many of us can truly claim to be able to recite this verse with greater depth of meaning, through greater understanding at the end of the day than we do at the beginning of the day? And indeed, more the next day and subsequently, so that our regular recitation of this chapter of Al-Hamd becomes a divine elevator, so that we may rise in our spiritual level through the constant repetitive recitation of this verse with mindfulness and not just ritually, so that we keep developing deeper and deeper insights that can manifest more fully, enabling us to live a more fulfilled life and have a stronger sense of self, inoculating ourselves from the challenges of depression. But also, when we do fall into that, as the teachings say will happen, it's natural, even the great prophets have fallen into that, we have the technique to be able to lift ourselves from it. And I'd like to end with an example of a famous prophet who did encounter the need for this nasta'in, who did require a divine help for a challenge that was beyond the realms of reasonableness, of something that was unreasonable, or something that was truly an extraordinary request. And this is in Surah Maryam, the chapter of Mary, in Surah 19, which is really a story of Zachariah asking for a son to inherit him. But this is really a story about the audacity of hope. This is a story about how this verse of إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ can be taken to a really high level, confident in the manifestation of grace. In verse 3 of this chapter of Maryam, it says, إِذْ نَادَ رَبَّهُ نِدَاءً خَفِيًّا, that when he called out to his Lord with a private, intimate supplication. And he says, in relation to seeking an heir, he says, "Oh Lord, my bones have weakened, my hair is white." So this idea of asking for a son at this advanced age is not a reasonable one. It's beyond reasonable, it's unreasonable. It's an audacious hope. But he says, وَلَمْ أَكُنْ بِدُعَائِكَ رَبِّ شَقِيًّا, but never have I been forlorn in my seeking your assistance. It gives us a completely different understanding of what nasta'een can mean in Surah Al-Hamd. And he goes on to say in the following verse, in verse 5 of Surah 19 of Surah Maryam, saying that I'm asking because I am afraid of what my relatives will do after me to the religion. But yet my wife is elderly, and so give me from your grace an heir. It is beyond the relative understanding that we may have of what a reasonable request would be. And what happens next? What is the response? We see in verse 7 that according to various commentaries of the Quran, an angelic messenger responds to him saying, Ya Zakaria, O Zakaria, inna nubashiruka bi ghulamin ismuhu Yahya, lam naj'alhu min qablu samiyya. O Zakaria, we bring you good news, good tidings of a son whose name will be John, Yahya. And this name has not been assigned before, giving us a really powerful example that even prophets like Zakaria feel despair sometimes, yet they draw upon these principles of nasta'een, of calling upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and receive the fulfillment of their requests by having the confidence that they are not alone. Join me therefore in a prayer for that Allah may elevate the souls of all those of our parents and teachers who have passed away and guided us to the beauty of the psychology of this verse. And let us conclude with reciting Surah Al-Hamd for their benefit. Surah Al-Mubarakat Al-Fatiha.